You can ignore your shadow, but it will never ignore you. Because what you hide controls you. What you face sets you free. If you feel stuck, trapped in repeating patterns, whether in your relationships, your emotions, or your way of living, this video is for you. And no, this isn't just another motivational talk. It's a deep dive into something most people don't have the courage to face, your shadow side. What I'm going to show you here can literally make you unrecognizable. Not to others, but to that version of yourself you're tired of carrying around. Over the next few minutes, you'll understand why everything you try to hide, your insecurities, your traumas, your most ugly reactions, actually contains a power you haven't accessed yet. And when you commit to this process for 30 days, what happens isn't just a temporary change, but a genuine realignment of your mind, your soul, and your energy. In this video, you'll learn how to use shadow work to free yourself from unconscious patterns, understand the forces that shape your psyche, like Jung's archetypes and the collective unconscious, and transform pain into potential. This is the kind of knowledge you won't easily find out there, and if you apply it seriously, it will put you on a level of awareness few people ever reach. If you think this is just self-help talk, maybe that's precisely because your shadow wants to keep everything the way it is. But if you stay here with me until the end, I promise, you'll never look at yourself the same way again. This content isn't about fixing you, it's about reminding you who you've always been, before you were shaped by fear, shame, or other people's expectations. So take a deep breath and come with me. Few people realize that what we fear most about revealing ourselves actually holds our greatest power. According to Carl Jung's depth psychology, the shadow represents all the parts of us that were repressed, denied, or forgotten. Not because they were inherently bad, but because at some point in our life, we learned they wouldn't be well received. The child who was criticized for being too hyperactive might have buried her spontaneity. The teenager who was mocked for being emotional might have stifled his sensitivity. This process happens without us even noticing. And here's the interesting part. The shadow is still there, silent yet active. What many people haven't understood about how the unconscious mind works is that anything that's rejected doesn't disappear. It just hides. And from Jung's perspective, the shadow isn't the villain of the story, but the vault where we bury both our traumas and our treasures. Yes, treasures. Within the shadow lie that smothered talent, the dormant strength, the boldness swallowed by fear of rejection. When we talk about Carl Jung and self-knowledge, we're talking about this journey of digging up what was buried, with courage and without judgment. Now think about it. How many times have you found yourself reacting in a way that didn't seem like you? Yelling when you swore you'd stay calm? Running away when you said you would stand firm? These automatic reactions are often clear signals that the shadow is in command. And do you know what's craziest? Most of our most important decisions are influenced by this invisible side. The collective unconscious, another key Jungian concept, also carries shadows inherited from society, culture, and family. Which means sometimes it's not even your shadow, it's your grandmother's. That's why understanding the shadow, according to Jung, is a profound invitation to true self-knowledge. It means getting off autopilot, stopping the repetition of patterns that should have been broken long ago, and finally seeing clearly what used to be just a vague internal noise. Is it hard work? Absolutely. But what you gain in return is the freedom to be who you are, without masks, without guilt, without armor. And for those seeking real growth, that's not a luxury, it's a calling. Here's a practical exercise. Start noticing which traits you judge most harshly in others. Envy, aggressiveness, coldness. Those criticisms reveal more about your shadow than about the other person. Write all of it down in a notebook, and give that notebook a symbolic name like My Inner Vault. This will come in handy when we talk about the shadow document later on. But before that, to better understand this inner architecture of the soul, we need to talk about the 4 archetypes of the psyche, which form the backbone of our personality. Inside the human mind, according to Carl Jung and his depth psychology, there are structures that shape how we think, feel, and act. He called these structures archetypes. And there are 4 that act as the main protagonists in our internal journey: persona, anima, animus, hero, and shadow. Each one plays a vital role in building our psyche. The persona, for instance, is the mask we use to be accepted socially. It's the character we create to fit into certain environments. The problem? Sometimes we get so attached to it that we forget who we really are. The hero, in turn, is that aspect that seeks to overcome challenges, that gets up after every fall. It sounds beautiful, and it is, but when this archetype is out of balance, a person might live in constant warfare with themselves, always trying to prove they're strong, never letting themselves rest or ask for help. The anima, the feminine in men, and the animus, the masculine in women, refer to our internal polarities. When we deny these energies, we run into relationship problems and a huge difficulty in connecting with our own essence. And of course, there's the shadow, the side we try to hide, which insists on showing us where the real healing work lies. These archetypes aren't random concepts, they're interacting all the time. The shadow, according to Jung, can invade the hero when a person refuses to face their weaknesses. The persona can dominate the anima, creating an emotional armor that blocks intuition and affection. This inner tangle explains a lot of the feelings we don't understand. That's why learning about Jung's archetypes is like having a roadmap of your own psychic universe. And guess what? Without that map, we go in circles, thinking life is against us when really, we're just ignoring the forces living inside us. Here's a practical example. Imagine someone who feels they always have to appear strong. Never cries, never asks for help, never admits fear. This person is trapped in the persona of the invulnerable hero, while their shadow accumulates pain, loneliness, and fragility. They probably live in emotional exhaustion, not understanding why. Recognizing this imbalance is the first step toward real change, and that kind of clarity is exactly what you find when you dive into Jung's teachings. Over time, you realize it's not about beating these archetypes, but integrating them in a healthy way. And that's only possible when we understand how the unconscious mind works. Speaking of the mind, we've only scratched the surface so far. Because now, to figure out why certain behaviors keep repeating like a broken record, we need to look more closely at the layers of the human mind. If the human mind were an iceberg, what we see, or rather, what we think we are, would be just the tip. According to Carl Jung's depth psychology, the mind is divided into 3 layers: the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious. The conscious mind makes up about 5% of what drives us. It's what we use for rational decision-making, replying to messages, planning our day. The subconscious, also 5%, stores memories and automatic habits like brushing your teeth or driving. But the unconscious, with its silent 90% influence, is the true control center of our lives. That's where the shadow lives, along with Jung's archetypes and the collective unconscious. It's mind-boggling to realize that most of what we feel, desire, or fear often goes unnoticed by us. The unconscious mind works behind the scenes, like a theater director who never steps on stage yet directs every movement. Have you ever wondered why you always attract the same toxic kind of relationship? Or why you procrastinate even when you want to change? Almost always. The answer lies in the hidden script your unconscious wrote, based on your traumas, old beliefs, and unresolved experiences. This knowledge can be a game changer. Understanding how the unconscious mind works gives you power, not the power to control everything, but to make clearer choices. When you identify the invisible patterns driving your actions, you begin to have real options. Not ones based on fear or autopilot, but conscious decisions aligned with who you want to become. An interesting exercise to start exploring this is, right before you sleep, write down this question on paper. What inside me is still in the dark? Then, when you wake up, jot down any image, phrase, or feeling that arises. Our unconscious communicates through symbols and metaphors, and it often speaks more clearly in our dreams. Start recording this. Over time, you'll notice patterns and powerful messages emerging. It's like digging for gold in the mud. It takes effort, but it's worth every shovel. And remember, diving into these layers is just the beginning. As soon as you realize that 90% of your mind was operating silently, your desire for deeper self-discovery becomes inevitable. That's where the next crucial step comes in, understanding the true meaning of self-knowledge and why it's the foundation of becoming who you were really born to be. Self-knowledge is one of those words we hear so often it can seem hollow. But when we view it through the lens of Jung's depth psychology, everything changes. Self-knowledge isn't just knowing what you like or recognizing your flaws. It's a deep dive into layers of the psyche that most people spend their lives avoiding. It's the journey back home to your essential truth. And the most interesting thing is that Jung said, what you avoid the most is exactly where your freedom lies. In other words, Jungian self-knowledge isn't about becoming something. It's about remembering who you always were, beneath the masks. That's why one of the biggest obstacles on this journey is confusing the persona with our true identity. The persona is indeed important. It helps us live in society. But when it turns into a prison rather than a bridge, that's when we start losing ourselves. You know those moments when you catch yourself acting like the model professional, the perfect daughter, or the helpful friend, but you feel a strange emptiness inside? That's your true essence trying to shout from underneath the persona. In this context, self-knowledge is the process of peeling back those layers and asking, is this really me, or is it just a role I learned to play? The curious thing is that the world constantly pushes us away from ourselves. Social media, for instance, fuels personas nonstop. You feel pressured to appear happy, productive, successful. But when you lie in bed, there's that silent discomfort. Why? Because there's a true you that's suffocating. This is one of the reasons shadow work, as proposed by Jung, is so transformative. It reconnects you with that original self, the one that exists before all expectations and masks. There's more. Without self-knowledge, we become easily manipulated by other people, by culture, or by our own shadow. You start seeking external validation, living to please other people's eyes, and that wears you down and makes you sick. What Jung proposed with his depth psychology was exactly the opposite, reclaiming that inner center, the axis of your own truth. That's why learning about Jung's archetypes, exploring the collective unconscious, and understanding the shadow according to Jung are real, practical steps for anyone wanting to stop repeating cycles and start creating a life with purpose. If you've stuck with me this far, maybe you're realizing how often you've given up your essence in order to fit in. That realization is already powerful, but now comes a deeper question. What has been the cost of hiding who you really are? Because the next point in our journey reveals the physical and emotional consequences of repressing your truth, and you might see the signs in your body and your everyday life more than you think. The mind may forget, but the body never does. Every repressed emotion finds a way to surface, unfortunately, not always gently. Jung said, "What we don't face within ourselves will manifest as fate." And he wasn't joking. By repressing important parts of who we are, our desires, angers, fears, and traumas, we store these energies in the most fundamental layer of our existence, the body. That explains why so many emotional problems turn into psychosomatic illnesses, chronic anxiety, recurring pain, inexplicable fatigue. All of it can be the result of neglecting a shadow we haven't acknowledged. By now, you may have felt that strange exhaustion from trying to keep up an image that doesn't match your essence. There's even a name for it, persona fatigue. It's the fatigue that comes from playing a role all the time. You become an actor in your own life, living to please, to appear a certain way, to belong. At the end of the day, even if you did everything right, you feel a deep emptiness, a nameless sadness. That's not drama, it's your soul's silent cry for attention. The most insidious part of this repression is how subtle it is. You stop saying what you think, expressing what you feel, living what you want. You trade freedom for acceptance, truth for approval, and that creates a split within you. Over time, that split becomes a chasm. Then the anxiety attacks with no apparent reason, the insomnia, the racing thoughts, the constant feeling that something's off, even though everything looks right on the outside. Jung shows us that this kind of imbalance grows out of the disconnect between who we are and who we pretend to be. Here's a practical example. Imagine a woman who is always taught to be nice. She avoids conflict, bottles up her tears, says yes when she wants to say no. Outwardly, everyone admires her. Inwardly, she's exhausted, anxious, and seething with repressed anger. Now imagine if she started acknowledging that anger, understanding where it comes from, and expressing it consciously and safely. That simple shift could change not only her emotional health, but her physical health as well. That's how shadow work, according to Jung, begins to heal. Of course, to manage that, it's not enough just to understand the mind. We also need to learn how to deal with what it feels, which brings us to a powerful element often ignored, emotional vulnerability. Now you'll see why the courage to open yourself up can actually be your greatest strength. Being vulnerable isn't weakness. It's actually one of the bravest choices a person can make. In a society that praises performance and vulnerability and handling it all, expressing emotions honestly is almost an act of rebellion. But Jung helps us see it differently. When we deny our vulnerability, we also deny the chance for deep connection with others and with ourselves. Jung teaches that unexpressed emotions turn into internal shadows that keep us from being authentic. How many times have you said, "I'm fine," when you actually wanted to break down? Or how many times have you felt guilty for feeling anger, fear, or jealousy? Because you were taught these emotions were ugly, wrong, or signs of weakness. That emotional suppression builds up until it explodes, often in disproportionate ways, or it solidifies into chronic sadness, apathy, or even physical illness. Moreover, learning to be vulnerable transforms relationships. When you show your truth, even if it comes with tears or doubts, you invite the other person to do the same. This builds a field of trust, of real connection, where you don't have to be on guard all the time. Jung said, "Shame is a soul afraid to be seen." And that's where the key lies. Knowing the difference between guilt and shame, for example, is transformative. Guilt says, "I did something wrong." Shame says, "I am wrong." One comes from your conscience, the other from your shadow. A simple but profound exercise is writing a letter you don't send. Choose someone you have unresolved conflict or hard feelings with. Put it all on paper: grudges, pain, confessions. You don't have to send it. The goal isn't confrontation, but releasing repressed emotion. This kind of practice activates the unconscious and starts dissolving emotional blocks. That's the point where knowledge stops being theory and becomes experience. Vulnerability is when you stop fighting who you are and begin talking to your emotions as if they were visitors, some uncomfortable, but each with something to teach. Now that you've started to make space for your emotional truth, it's time to look directly at what's been hidden, camouflaged, or swept under the rug. Yes, the moment has come to create your own shadow document. And this exercise can be a turning point in your transformation. It's time to shed light on what's been lurking in the dark. Creating your shadow document is like turning on a flashlight in a basement full of boxes that have been closed for years. Some will contain uncomfortable memories. Others will reveal forgotten treasures. The goal isn't to judge, but to recognize. And why is this so powerful? Because according to Carl Jung and depth psychology, anything that isn't recognized will continue to control you in the dark. By putting your repressed characteristics, impulsive actions, and unacceptable thoughts on paper, you take away the power they hold over you. They stop being monsters and become messages. But how do you do it? Simple. Grab a notebook or open a digital note titled My Shadow. Then divide it into 3 columns. 1, traits I avoid in myself, for example, envy, vanity, selfishness. 2, behaviors I regret but keep repeating. 3, behaviors in others that most irritate me. Be honest. Nobody else will read this. It's just between you and your truth. Over time, you'll notice some of these items have patterns that repeat in various parts of your life. That's where self-knowledge becomes powerful. It shows you that what you reject in yourself is often a wounded part that needs integration, not discarding. Don't fall into the trap of trying to fix everything at once. This isn't an exercise in correction, but in integration. What does that mean? You learn to talk with these parts, not silence them. If you discover, for example, that you're angry at controlling people, ask yourself, where am I being controlling with myself? At what point in my life did this trait protect me? This kind of self-reflection is what makes the journey of self-knowledge so transformative. Over time, you can go back to this document and see that some shadow aspects have softened. Others remain, asking for more attention. That's okay. The important thing is to keep this channel open. Jung said, integrating the shadow is a journey, not an event. So don't demand perfection. Demand presence. And if you want to go even deeper, try writing letters to these parts of your shadow. It may sound strange, but it's incredibly liberating. After all, once you understand how the unconscious mind works, you see that internal dialogue is the first step to real change. And here's what happens when you start acknowledging and embracing these repressed parts. They stop sabotaging you in moments of crisis. It's as if, gradually, you build a trusting relationship with yourself. And speaking of crises, now we're going to explore the difference between reacting in defense mode and responding consciously, tapping into the power hidden in your own shadow. When something hurts or threatens us, we automatically go into one of 2 modes, defense or attack. It's survival instinct at work. But often, this instinct isn't responding to the present moment. It's responding to old wounds stored in the shadow. Have you ever found yourself exploding over something trivial or freezing up at a simple criticism? These are signs that the shadow is at the wheel. Carl Jung's depth psychology shows that when we don't recognize our internal triggers, they start controlling us in the most critical situations. Knowing how the unconscious mind works is recognizing that many of these reactions stem from unresolved stories. Defense mode surfaces when you shut down, withdraw, or go silent. Attack mode shows up as aggression, sarcasm, judgment, or running away. Both are attempts to protect parts of your psyche that aren't yet integrated, many of them hiding in the shadow. It's as if a wounded self from the past emerges to shield you, but ends up sabotaging your present version. And once you name that shadow, once you see it, something changes. You stop identifying with the reaction. You start observing. You take a breath before you act. And while it's a simple shift, it's deeply transformative. A practice that can help immensely is creating a symbolic character for your shadow. Give it a name, a shape, and a personality. This helps create space between who you are and what you're feeling. For instance, if you sense your shadow is controlling and rigid, you might call it Captain Control. When you realize you're reacting that way, think to yourself, the captain is in charge now. It reduces the intensity of the identification and brings lightness to the process. This is a powerful technique inspired by the symbolic approach of Carl Jung's psychology. Interestingly, simply naming it changes your relationship with the shadow. It stops being a monster in the dark and becomes a part of you that just wants to protect you, even if clumsily. This kind of awareness shortens how long you stay in anger, anxiety, or guilt. Over time, you see that the power doesn't lie in never feeling these emotions, but in not being dominated by them. That's true self-knowledge, knowing who's speaking inside you and consciously choosing how to respond. So, little by little, you develop a healthier relationship with your shadow. You become an ally of your own mind, no longer its hostage. Now that you've learned to communicate with your inner darkness, it's time to take another step, understanding how the shadow shows up outside you, through judgments and everyday conflicts. Yes, now we'll talk about psychological projection. That subtle mechanism that reveals what you most need to see in others. Judging others is often an unconscious way of running from ourselves. Jung coined one of the most revealing statements in depth psychology. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. That's psychological projection, a mechanism by which parts of our shadow are projected onto another person's behavior. In other words, what you judge so harshly, what knocks you off balance, what makes you lose control, might be reflecting something you haven't accepted in yourself. It's uncomfortable, yes, but it's also one of the most powerful keys to self-knowledge in a Jungian sense. Here's a practical example. You find yourself losing patience in traffic, calling everyone irresponsible. Deep down, perhaps you're really upset at yourself for not allowing any errors. Or someone on social media appears extremely confident and it bothers you. Could it be that you struggle to express yourself with confidence? Understanding how the unconscious mind works means realizing that the external world often mirrors our internal world. And instead of using that mirror to judge others, you can start using it to truly see yourself. Projection also happens in more intimate relationships with partners, parents, children, friends. That annoying habit in the other person might be your shadow's way of telling you to acknowledge something repressed in yourself. And this doesn't mean everything is your fault, of course not, but it does invite self-observation before you react. When you start seeing these mirrors in daily life, the world becomes a giant classroom, and every difficult situation becomes a lesson from your unconscious. A simple yet transformative exercise. Whenever someone or something drives you crazy, write down in a short sentence why it upsets you. Then ask yourself, what does this say about me? Or where am I like this with myself or with others? Doing this regularly will help you identify patterns that were on autopilot. And it's precisely this type of awareness that initiates the process of shadow integration, an essential part of Jung's path for those who want to stop repeating the same cycles and start consciously creating their own reality. And if the shadow already shows up in our individual day-to-day, imagine the impact it has collectively. Judging others is often an unconscious way of escaping ourselves. Jung coined one of the most revealing statements in depth psychology. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. That's psychological projection, a mechanism by which parts of our shadow are projected onto another person's behavior. In other words, what you judge so harshly, what knocks you off balance, what makes you lose control, might be reflecting something you haven't accepted in yourself. It's uncomfortable, yes, but it's also one of the most powerful keys to Jungian self-knowledge. Here's a practical example. You find yourself losing patience in traffic, calling everyone irresponsible. Deep down, maybe you're irritated at not allowing any mistakes in yourself. Or someone on social media appears extremely confident and that annoys you. Could it be that you haven't yet developed the confidence you desire? Understanding how the unconscious mind works means seeing that the external world often mirrors your internal world. And instead of using that mirror to judge others, you can use it to truly see yourself. Projection also arises in more intimate relationships with partners, parents, children, or friends. That other person's annoying habit may be nudging you to recognize something suppressed in yourself. It doesn't mean everything is your fault, of course, but it's an invitation to self-observation before reacting. When you start noticing these mirrors in your daily life, the world becomes a massive classroom, and every difficult situation becomes a lesson from your unconscious. That's Jung's archetypes in motion, teaching you through everyday relationships. A simple yet powerful exercise. Whenever someone or something really annoys you, jot down in one sentence what caused it. Then ask yourself, what does this say about me? Or where in my life do I act like this, toward myself or others? Practicing this consistently will help you identify patterns that were operating automatically. It's exactly this kind of awareness that begins the process of integrating the shadow, an essential step in Jung's teachings for those seeking to break free of old cycles and start consciously shaping their reality. And if the shadow already operates in our individual day-to-day, imagine its impact at the collective level. That's why the next step is to understand how the collective shadow influences mass behavior, cultural beliefs, and even social movements. Get ready to see the psyche from a broader and surprising perspective. The shadow isn't just an individual phenomenon. It also appears in groups. Carl Jung referred to this as the collective shadow, a facet of the collective unconscious that holds everything an entire society prefers not to see about itself. In other words, while individuals repress undesirable emotions, the culture represses values, behaviors, and historical events that threaten its ideal self-image. Racism, intolerance, sexism, beauty standards, all these are expressions of the collective shadow. And when we ignore this social shadow, it erupts in violence, polarization, and mass emotional crises. Think about it. In a culture that idolizes productivity, rest becomes guilt. In a system that glorifies success at all costs, failure becomes shame. The result? Millions living under pressure, pretending they have everything under control, but crying silently at night. That's what we see every day on social media, a polished showcase hiding emotional chasms. This is the game of the collective persona. And as Jung would say, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. If you're wondering where it all starts, the answer is simple. It starts with you. Transform yourself, and you change the field around you. A practical example. Notice how the cult of the perfect body affects the self-image of millions, even those not directly striving for that standard. That's because we're all immersed in the same symbolic soup of the social unconscious. Often, what feels like a personal problem is actually a collective symptom. That's why working on your personal shadow isn't selfish. It's an act of service. When you heal in yourself what you inherited from your culture, your family, or your generation, you help ease the weight of the collective shadow as well. Again, this isn't about fighting society, but about understanding it more consciously. When you grasp the unconscious motives behind mass behavior, you stop being a puppet. You start choosing. It's the difference between being swept by the wave and learning to surf it. That applies to everything: consumption, politics, relationships. Studying Carl Jung's depth psychology gives you that key. You start seeing symbols where you once only saw news, behaviors, or trends, and that perspective changes everything. Now, if the collective shadow already shapes our values and emotions, imagine its impact on romantic relationships. Yes, many of your passions, disappointments, and repeated patterns in love may be guided by the shadow. Not only yours, but the culture's shadow that you breathe in every day. You don't fall in love by chance, nor do you choose partners purely by logic. Your heart often follows maps sketched by your unconscious. Carl Jung said that the other person mirrors what we need to integrate in ourselves. That's why so often you're drawn to those who embody the very part of your shadow you haven't yet dared to face. It's like the universe saying, "You don't want to see this on your own? Fine, I'll send someone who reflects it back to you." It seems magical, but it's really just psychology in action. How many of us repeat the same type of relationship with just a different face? The toxic partner, the emotionally unavailable partner, the cycle of jealousy, control, or abandonment. All this can be a dance between two shadows that recognize, attract, and feed each other. The shadow, according to Jung, doesn't only show up in moments of crisis. It also shows up in enchantment, in that overwhelming passion, in that feeling of, "I feel like I've known this person forever." That's the shadow weaving behind the veil of romantic love. But relax. This doesn't mean every passion is a trap or that love is an illusion. Quite the opposite. When you're aware of the shadow, relationships can become healing tools instead of battlefields. The big shift happens when, instead of blaming the other person, you ask, "What is this relationship trying to teach me about myself?" That single reflection changes everything. Because true love doesn't begin when you find the right person. It begins when you find yourself, whole. A simple yet powerful exercise. Write down details about your last relationships. What captivated you? What hurt you? What keeps repeating? Then reflect, what do these patterns say about my relationship with myself? Sometimes the shadow appears as neediness disguised as love, or emotional dependence disguised as passion. Recognizing this grants you freedom to love more consciously, openly, and genuinely. And when love doesn't arise from a sense of need but from wholeness, it stops being a battlefield and becomes an expansion of both individuals. And look, this kind of self-analysis isn't always easy, because the pain you carry can be deep, but that's exactly where the gold lies. There's an ancient wisdom that says, "The wound is the place where the light enters." Jung believed the same, that what hurts you most can become your greatest source of transformation. It's the process of psychological alchemy, where pain is the lead and self-knowledge is the fire that turns it into gold. Many people try to escape pain, silence suffering, or numb discomfort. But true growth begins when we look at the wound with presence and ask, "What are you trying to teach me?" Jung tells us it's not about removing symptoms. It's about finding meaning. Look at great artists, spiritual leaders, or entrepreneurs who changed the world. Many began their journeys from deeply painful experiences. Failures, abuse, loss, rejection, those can become creative and spiritual fuel. And you don't have to be famous for that to happen. Everyone carries a unique potential born from the wounds they've faced. Your pain can be the key to helping others, creating something new, or changing your reality. That's the essence of self-knowledge, turning suffering into awareness and awareness into purpose. A practical example? Imagine someone who grew up experiencing abandonment. If ignored, that pain turns into neediness, jealousy, and insecurity. But if acknowledged and worked on, it can blossom into sensitivity, empathy, and the ability to care for others. That's alchemy. What used to break you now becomes your strength. And it's not magic, it's a process. It's you, intentionally choosing not to be the victim of your story, but the author of a new narrative. If you want to start that process now, begin by writing about your greatest pain. Then ask, what have I developed because of it? What strength was born in me? This simple exercise can open doors you never imagined, because pain, when welcomed, becomes wisdom. And Jung knew that. He saw the shadow not as an enemy, but as a channel for awakening consciousness. The more you dive into this process, the more you realize there's an invitation to expand within the pain, because exploring those depths takes courage. It's crucial to learn how to take care of yourself along the way. The soul, once it starts opening up, needs structure, solid ground. Diving into the unconscious is like descending into a deep cave. You'll find treasures, but you also need ropes, flashlights, and preparation. That's where grounding and self-care practices come in. Carl Jung said the process of individuation, this journey toward self-knowledge, requires structure because the deeper you go into the psyche, the more present you need to be in your body. Put another way, spirituality without grounding becomes escapism. That's why, as you integrate your shadow, you also need to cultivate habits that anchor you in the here and now. One of the most effective ways to stay anchored is through conscious journaling. Writing daily about how you feel, what you think, or what you're discovering helps you bring order to your inner chaos. It doesn't have to be pretty or logical, just honest. Plus, simple practices like walking barefoot on grass, getting some sunlight, drinking water mindfully, or taking 3 minutes to breathe deeply each day have a much bigger effect than they seem. They tell your nervous system, we are safe. That activates what science calls a regulated state, and what Jung would call connection with the self. Another essential tool is movement. Psychic energy needs to flow, and the body is its main vehicle. Dance, yoga, martial arts, walking, swimming. What matters is moving with awareness. When you work with the shadow, heavy emotions can arise, and physical movement helps release them from your system. That's true self-care. Equally important is establishing a basic routine of emotional self-care. Sleep, nutrition, rest, breaks. It's like building an internal altar of self-respect. Remember, doing self-knowledge work doesn't mean disconnecting from the world. It's precisely the opposite. Here's a special tip. Have an emotional emergency kit. It can include a playlist that calms you, a list of empowering phrases, an essential oil, a prayer, or a book that uplifts you, like The Power of Now, Women Who Run with the Wolves, or Jung's Red Book. Whenever you feel unsteady, use this kit as a point of reconnection. This is a practical way to care for yourself while you dive into deep topics such as Jung's archetypes, the collective unconscious, and the shadow according to Jung. Now that you've built this solid base with understanding, exercises, and tools, it's time to integrate everything. After all, the goal of shadow work isn't to dig endlessly into our wounds. It's to live with greater authenticity, presence, and freedom. And that brings us to the final conclusion of this journey: how to turn this knowledge into real, deep practice in your life. Integrating the shadow isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. When you begin to acknowledge, embrace, and converse with parts of yourself you once rejected, something changes forever. You start living with more freedom, more authenticity, and less fear. It isn't easy, I know, but it's real. And the freedom you seek doesn't lie in control. It lies in integration. Now tell me, which part of your shadow do you feel ready to face head on? Leave a comment below. It might be an emotion, a behavior, or a pattern that keeps resurfacing. This is a safe space. You're not alone in this journey. If I can offer one piece of advice, it's this. Start your shadow document today. You already have the tools. You already have the awareness. You just need to take that first step, even if it's small, because 30 days might sound like nothing, until you decide to commit to your truth. And if this video moved you in any way, awakened something inside, subscribe to the channel. Here we're going to keep exploring what nobody talks about, but everyone feels. Turn on notifications so you won't miss any content, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. The journey continues, and you didn't come this far just to stop now.